It was a busy morning in the courtroom. The air was thick with tension, and the room was packed with people waiting for their cases to be heard. The judge, a respected figure known for his fairness and calm demeanor, sat at the bench. He was a man of few words but carried an air of authority that commanded respect. His dark robe and stern expression made it clear that he was in charge, and he took his role seriously. On the other side of the room, a well-known politician sat at the defendant's table. He was a man who had built his career on charisma and bold statements. Over the years, he had gained a reputation for being outspoken, sometimes even rude, especially when things didn't go his way. Today, he was in court over a controversial case that had been making headlines for weeks. The media was watching closely, and the politician knew that all eyes were on him. As the proceedings began, the judge listened carefully to the arguments presented by both sides. He asked questions to clarify points and made sure everyone had a chance to speak. His tone was calm and measured, but there was a firmness in his voice that left no room for disrespect. The politician, however, seemed restless. He shifted in his seat, tapped his fingers on the table, and occasionally rolled his eyes when the judge spoke. It was clear that he wasn't used to being told what to do. When it was his turn to speak, the politician stood up and addressed the court. At first, his words were measured, but as he went on, his tone began to change. He started to argue with the judge, challenging his decisions and questioning his authority. The room fell silent as the tension grew. Everyone could feel that something was about to happen. Then, in a moment that shocked everyone, the politician crossed a line. He made a comment that was not only disrespectful but also racially charged. The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and the room seemed to freeze. The judge, who had remained calm throughout the proceedings, slowly leaned forward. His expression changed, and for the first time that day, there was a flicker of anger in his eyes. The politician, realizing he had gone too far, tried to backtrack. He stammered and attempted to explain himself, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The judge raised his hand, silencing the room. He took a deep breath and then spoke in a voice that was calm but carried the weight of authority. He addressed the politician directly, calling out his behavior and making it clear that such disrespect would not be tolerated in his courtroom. The room was silent as the judge delivered his rebuke. The politician, who had always been so confident and outspoken, suddenly looked small and unsure. He sat down without another word, his face pale. The judge then turned to the rest of the room and continued with the proceedings as if nothing had happened. But everyone knew that something significant had just taken place. As the session ended and people began to leave the courtroom, whispers filled the air. The politician quickly gathered his things and left, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The judge, on the other hand, remained seated, his expression unreadable. It was clear that this was not just another day in court. Something had shifted, and the consequences of the politician's actions were yet to unfold. The news of what happened in the courtroom spread like wildfire. By the time the politician reached his car, his phone was buzzing non-stop with calls and messages. Reporters were already outside the courthouse, shouting questions and trying to get a statement. Cameras flashed as he pushed through the crowd, his face tight with anger and embarrassment. He didn't stop to answer any questions. Instead, he got into his car and sped away, leaving the chaos behind. Back inside the courthouse, the judge took a moment to collect himself. He had seen many things in his years on the bench, but this incident had struck a nerve. It wasn't just the disrespect, it was the underlying tone of the politician's words that had cut deep. The judge was no stranger to prejudice, but he had always believed that his position and the law would protect him from such blatant disrespect. Today, that belief had been shaken. As he left the courtroom, his staff noticed that he was quieter than usual. They didn't ask questions, but they could tell that something was weighing on him. The judge returned to his chambers and closed the door. For a few minutes, he sat at his desk, staring at the wall. He thought about the politicians' words and the way they had been delivered. It wasn't just an insult, it was a reminder of the challenges he had faced throughout his career. He had worked hard to earn his position, and he had always tried to be fair and just. But moments like this made him wonder if some people would never see him as anything more than the color of his skin. Meanwhile, the politicians' team was scrambling to do damage control. They knew that the incident could have serious consequences, not just for the case but for his career. Social media was already buzzing with reactions. Some people were defending the politician, saying that he had been misunderstood or that his words had been taken out of context. But many others were outraged. They called his comments racist and demanded accountability. Hashtags started trending, and the story quickly made its way to national news. The politicians' advisors held an emergency meeting to discuss their next steps. They knew they had to act fast. One of them suggested issuing a public apology, but the politician resisted. He didn't want to admit fault, fearing it would make him look weak. Instead, he argued that they should focus on spinning the narrative. "We need to shift the focus away from this," he said. "Make it about something else, anything else." But the public wasn't easily distracted. Videos of the incident began circulating online, and people were dissecting every word and gesture. The judge's calm but firm response was praised, while the politician's behavior was widely condemned. Even some of his supporters began to question his judgment. The pressure was mounting, and it was clear that this wasn't going to blow over anytime soon. As the day turned into evening, the judge decided to head home. He knew he needed to clear his head and get some rest. But as he walked to his car, he noticed a small group of people waiting outside the courthouse. They weren't reporters, they were ordinary citizens who had come to show their support. One of them, a young woman, stepped forward and handed him a note. "Thank you for standing up for what's right," it read. The judge smiled for the first time that day. He thanked her and the others, feeling a small sense of reassurance. That night, the politician couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, replaying the events of the day in his mind. He kept thinking about the judge's reaction and the way the room had fallen silent. For the first time in a long time, he felt a pang of regret. He had always been so confident, so sure of himself. But now, he was starting to wonder if he had gone too far. He thought about his career and the reputation he had built over the years. Was it all going to come crashing down because of one moment of arrogance? The next morning, the story was still dominating the news. The politicians' team had released a statement overnight, but it did little to calm the storm. The statement was vague and didn't address the specific comments he had made. Instead, it talked about the importance of respect and understanding, without acknowledging any wrongdoing. The public saw it as insincere, and the backlash only grew stronger. The judge, on the other hand, arrived at the courthouse early. He had a full day of cases ahead, and he was determined to focus on his work. But as he walked through the halls, he could feel the weight of what had happened the day before. His colleagues offered words of support, and even some of the lawyers who usually argued against him in court took a moment to express their respect. It was a small comfort, but it reminded him that he wasn't alone. As the day went on, the judge couldn't help but think about the bigger picture. This wasn't just about one rude comment or one moment of disrespect. It was about the systemic issues that still existed, even in places where they shouldn't. He knew that his response in the courtroom had been important, but he also knew that real change would take more than just one moment of standing up to injustice. The politician, meanwhile, was facing a growing crisis. His team was struggling to contain the fallout, and his opponents were seizing the opportunity to criticize him. Some of his allies were starting to distance themselves, worried about being associated with the controversy. He knew he had to do something, but he wasn't sure what. For the first time in his career, he felt like he was losing control. By the end of the day, both men were exhausted. The judge went home to his family, finding solace in their love and support. The politician, however, was alone with his thoughts. He sat in his office, staring at the news on his computer screen. The headlines were brutal, and the comments were even worse. He knew he had to make a decision, but he wasn't ready to face the consequences of his actions. The story was far from over, and the ripple effects of that day in court were only just beginning. The next few days were a whirlwind. The story of the politician's disrespectful behavior in court had taken on a life of its own. It wasn't just a local scandal anymore, it had become a national conversation. News outlets, talk shows, and social media platforms were all buzzing with discussions about the incident. People were debating everything from the politician's character to the broader issues of race and respect in society. The judge, meanwhile, tried to stay focused on his work. He had always believed that his role was to serve the law, not to become the center of attention. But it was hard to ignore the fact that he had become a symbol of dignity and strength for many people. Letters and emails poured into his office, most of them expressing support and gratitude. Some shared their own stories of facing discrimination, while others simply thanked him for standing up for what was right. The judge read a few of them, touched by the outpouring of kindness, but he didn't let it distract him from his duties. On the other side of town, the politician was facing a very different kind of attention. His team had tried to downplay the incident, but their efforts only seemed to make things worse. The public saw their attempts to spin the story as dishonest, and the backlash grew stronger. Protesters gathered outside his office, holding signs and chanting slogans demanding accountability. Some of his longtime supporters began to speak out against him, saying they were disappointed in his behavior. Even members of his own party were starting to distance themselves, worried about the impact on their own reputations. The politician knew he had to do something, but he wasn't sure what. His advisors were divided. Some urged him to issue a full apology, admitting his mistake and asking for forgiveness. Others argued that doing so would make him look weak and could hurt his career even more. "You can't give in to the mob," one of them said. "If you apologize, they'll just keep coming after you." But the pressure was becoming unbearable. The politician couldn't go anywhere without being followed by reporters or confronted by angry citizens. His social media accounts were flooded with comments, many of them harsh and unforgiving. He tried to avoid looking at them, but it was impossible to ignore the constant stream of criticism. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was losing control of the narrative. One evening, after another long and frustrating day, the politician sat alone in his office. He stared at the blank screen of his computer, trying to figure out what to do. He thought about the judge and the way he had handled the situation in court. There had been no anger, no shouting, just a calm but firm response that had left no room for argument. The politician couldn't help but admire that, even as he resented the consequences of his own actions. Finally, he made a decision. He called his team and told them he wanted to hold a press conference. "I need to address this head-on," he said. "No more dodging, no more spinning. I have to take responsibility." His advisors were hesitant, but they could see that he was serious. They spent the next few hours preparing a statement, carefully choosing every word. The politician practiced delivering it, trying to strike the right tone, sincere but not overly emotional, apologetic but not weak. It wasn't easy, but he knew it was the only way forward. The next morning, the press conference was scheduled to take place outside his office. A large crowd had gathered, including reporters, protesters, and curious onlookers. The atmosphere was tense as the politician stepped up to the microphone. He took a deep breath and began to speak. "I want to start by saying that I take full responsibility for my actions in court the other day," he said. "My words were disrespectful and inappropriate, and I deeply regret them. I want to apologize to the judge, to the court, and to everyone who was hurt or offended by what I said. That is not who I am, and it is not what I stand for." He went on to talk about the importance of respect and understanding, acknowledging that his behavior had fallen short of those values. He also addressed the racial undertones of his comments, something he had avoided doing until now. "I understand that my words carried a weight that I didn't fully appreciate at the time," he said. "I have a lot to learn, and I am committed to doing better." The crowd listened in silence as he spoke. Some people nodded, while others looked skeptical. When he finished, there was a moment of quiet before the questions began. Reporters asked about his intentions, his future plans, and whether he thought this apology was enough to repair the damage. The politician answered as honestly as he could, but he knew that not everyone would be satisfied. As the press conference ended, the politician felt a mix of relief and uncertainty. He had done what he thought was right, but he had no idea how it would be received. The next few hours would be critical, and he braced himself for whatever came next. Meanwhile, the judge watched the press conference from his home. He had been curious to see how the politician would handle the situation, and he was surprised by the sincerity of the apology. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step in the right direction. The judge knew that forgiveness wasn't always easy, but he also believed in the power of second chances. He hoped that this incident would serve as a learning opportunity, not just for the politician but for everyone who had been watching. As the day went on, reactions to the press conference began to pour in. Some people praised the politician for taking responsibility, while others remained skeptical. The story was far from over, but it felt like a turning point had been reached. Both the judge and the politician knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but they also knew that it was a road worth taking. The days following the politician's press conference were a mix of progress and turbulence. While some people accepted his apology and appreciated his willingness to take responsibility, others remained unconvinced. Social media was still flooded with debates, and the story continued to dominate the news cycle. The politician's team worked tirelessly to manage the fallout, but it was clear that the incident had left a lasting mark on his reputation. The judge, on the other hand, tried to stay out of the spotlight. He had no interest in becoming a public figure or engaging in the ongoing drama. His focus remained on his work and the principles he had always stood for. However, he couldn't ignore the fact that his actions in the courtroom had resonated with so many people. Strangers approached him in public to thank him, and he received countless messages of support from across the country. It was humbling, but it also made him reflect on the larger issues at play. One evening, after a long day at the courthouse, the judge sat in his study at home. The room was quiet, and the soft glow of a lamp illuminated the shelves filled with books and legal documents. He leaned back in his chair, thinking about the events of the past week. He had always believed in the power of the law to bring about justice, but this incident had reminded him that the law alone wasn't enough. True justice required empathy, understanding, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. He thought about the politician and the apology he had delivered. The judge had been skeptical at first, but he could see that the man was trying to make amends. It wasn't easy to admit fault, especially in such a public way, and the judge respected that. Still, he wondered if the politician truly understood the weight of his actions. An apology was a good first step, but real change required more than just words. The next morning, the judge arrived at the courthouse to find a small crowd waiting outside. They weren't there to protest or demand answers, they were there to show their support. A group of local activists had organized a peaceful demonstration to honor the judge and his commitment to fairness and equality. They held signs that read, "Justice starts with respect," and "Thank you for standing tall." The judge was moved by the gesture. He took a moment to speak with them, shaking hands and expressing his gratitude. It was a reminder that, despite the challenges, there were still people who believed in doing the right thing. Meanwhile, the politician was facing a different kind of crowd. His office was still receiving a flood of calls and emails, some supportive but many critical. His team had hoped that the press conference would help to calm the storm, but it was clear that the road to redemption would be a long one. The politician knew he had to do more to regain the public's trust, but he wasn't sure where to start. One of his advisors suggested that he take some time off to reflect and regroup. "You need to step back and think about how you want to move forward," the advisor said. "This isn't just about damage control, it's about showing people that you're committed to change." The politician agreed. He knew he couldn't keep going at the same pace without addressing the deeper issues that had led to the incident. He decided to take a short leave of absence, using the time to meet with community leaders, educators, and activists. He wanted to listen and learn, to understand the perspectives of those who had been hurt by his actions. It wasn't easy, many people were hesitant to meet with him, and some outright refused. But the politician was determined to prove that he was serious about making amends. One of the people he reached out to was a well-known civil rights advocate who had been vocal about the incident. At first, the advocate was reluctant to meet, but after some persuasion, they agreed to sit down with the politician. The meeting was tense at first, but as they talked, the politician began to understand the impact of his words in a way he never had before. The advocate shared personal stories of discrimination and explained how comments like his perpetuated harmful stereotypes. It was a difficult conversation, but it was also an eye-opening one. As the days went by, the politician began to see things differently. He realized that his apology, while important, was only the beginning. If he wanted to truly make a difference, he had to take concrete steps to address the issues he had helped to perpetuate. He started by drafting a plan to support initiatives aimed at promoting racial equality and understanding. He also reached out to the judge, requesting a meeting to apologize in person. The judge was initially hesitant. He had no desire to rehash the incident or engage in a public spectacle. But after some consideration, he agreed to meet. He believed in the importance of dialogue and thought it might be an opportunity to encourage the politician to take meaningful action. The meeting took place in the judge's chambers, away from the cameras and the noise of the outside world. The atmosphere was formal but not hostile. The politician began by expressing his regret and acknowledging the harm he had caused. He spoke about the steps he was taking to educate himself and make amends, and he asked for the judge's guidance on how he could do better. The judge listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. When the politician finished speaking, the judge nodded slowly. "I appreciate your apology," he said. "But what matters now is what you do next. Words are important, but actions are what truly make a difference. If you're serious about change, you have to be willing to put in the work, not just for a week or a month, but for the long term." The politician nodded, understanding the weight of the judge's words. He knew that this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey, but he was determined to see it through. As the meeting ended, the judge felt a sense of cautious optimism. He didn't know if the politician would follow through on his promises, but he believed in the possibility of redemption. For his part, the politician left the courthouse with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew he had a lot to prove, but he was ready to take the first steps toward becoming a better person and a better leader. The story was far from over, but it felt like a new chapter was beginning, one that held the promise of growth, understanding, and, perhaps, healing. The weeks that followed were a test of the politician's resolve. He had made a public commitment to change, but now he had to prove it through his actions. It wasn't easy. Every step he took was scrutinized, and not everyone was willing to give him a second chance. But he was determined to stay the course, no matter how difficult it became. One of the first things he did was to meet with community leaders and organizations that focused on racial justice and equality. He listened to their concerns and ideas, asking questions and taking notes. He didn't try to defend himself or make excuses, he simply listened. It was a humbling experience, but it was also enlightening. He began to see the world through a different lens, one that he had ignored for far too long. The judge, meanwhile, continued to go about his work with the same dedication and integrity he had always shown. He didn't seek out attention or praise, but he couldn't help noticing the impact his actions had had on others. People from all walks of life reached out to him, sharing their own stories and thanking him for standing up for what was right. It was a reminder that even small acts of courage could have a ripple effect, inspiring others to do the same. One day, the judge received a letter from a young law student. The student wrote about how the incident in the courtroom had inspired them to pursue a career in law, with the goal of fighting for justice and equality. The judge was deeply moved by the letter. It reminded him of why he had chosen this path in the first place and gave him hope for the future. As the politician continued his efforts to make amends, he faced both support and skepticism. Some people praised him for taking responsibility and trying to do better, while others accused him of only doing it to save his career. The criticism was hard to take, but he tried to stay focused on his goals. He knew that rebuilding trust would take time, and he was prepared to put in the work. One of the initiatives he launched was a series of town hall meetings in communities that had been disproportionately affected by systemic racism. The meetings were open to the public, and the politician encouraged people to share their experiences and ideas. The first few meetings were tense, with many attendees expressing anger and distrust. But as the politician listened and responded with sincerity, the atmosphere began to shift. People started to see that he was genuinely trying to understand and make a difference. At one of the town halls, an elderly man stood up to speak. His voice trembled with emotion as he shared his story of facing discrimination throughout his life. He talked about the pain of being treated as less than human simply because of the color of his skin. The room fell silent as he spoke, and when he finished, there were tears in many eyes. The politician, visibly moved, thanked the man for sharing his story and promised to do everything in his power to fight for change. The judge, who had been following the politician's efforts from a distance, was cautiously optimistic. He knew that real change required more than just words or gestures, it required sustained effort and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But he also believed in the power of redemption and the possibility of growth. He hoped that the politician's actions would inspire others to reflect on their own biases and take steps toward creating a more just and equitable society. As the weeks turned into months, the politician's efforts began to yield results. He worked with lawmakers to introduce legislation aimed at addressing systemic racism and promoting equality. He also partnered with community organizations to support programs that provided education, resources, and opportunities to marginalized communities. It was a slow and often frustrating process, but he remained committed to the cause. One day, the politician received an invitation to speak at a conference on racial justice. It was a significant opportunity, but it also came with a lot of pressure. He knew that his every word would be scrutinized, and he wanted to make sure he got it right. He spent days preparing his speech, consulting with advisors and community leaders to ensure that his message was clear and meaningful. When the day of the conference arrived, the politician stood before a large audience, his heart pounding with nervousness. He took a deep breath and began to speak. He talked about his journey over the past few months, acknowledging his mistakes and the harm he had caused. He spoke about the lessons he had learned and the steps he was taking to make amends. But most importantly, he talked about the need for all of us to confront our own biases and work together to create a more just and equitable society. The audience listened intently, and when he finished, there was a moment of silence before the room erupted into applause. It wasn't just polite clapping, it was a genuine expression of appreciation and hope. The politician felt a surge of emotion as he realized that his words had resonated with people. It was a small but significant step forward on his long road to redemption. The judge, who had been watching the speech from home, felt a sense of pride. He didn't know if the politician's efforts would lead to lasting change, but he believed in the power of second chances. He knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but he also knew that it was a road worth taking. As the story continued to unfold, both the judge and the politician remained committed to their respective paths. The judge continued to serve with integrity and fairness, inspiring others through his actions. The politician, humbled by his mistakes, worked tirelessly to make amends and fight for justice. Their journeys were different, but they were united by a common goal: to create a world where respect, understanding, and equality prevailed. The politician's speech at the Racial Justice Conference marked a turning point in his journey. While not everyone was ready to forgive him, many people began to see his efforts as genuine. The media coverage shifted from focusing solely on his past mistakes to highlighting the work he was doing to address systemic issues. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but it was progress. One of the most significant outcomes of the conference was the formation of a new coalition dedicated to combating racial inequality. The politician played a key role in bringing together lawmakers, activists, and community leaders to create a unified plan of action. The coalition's first project was to address disparities in education, an issue that had long been ignored. They proposed legislation to increase funding for schools in underserved communities and provide resources for students who needed extra support. The judge, who had been quietly observing the politician's efforts, was impressed by the coalition's work. He saw it as a tangible step toward creating real change, and it gave him hope for the future. He even agreed to serve as an advisor to the coalition, offering his expertise and perspective to help guide their efforts. It was a rare move for the judge, who invitation. When the day arrived, he stood before a crowd of students, parents, and teachers, his heart filled with emotion. "This is a day of celebration," he began. "But it's also a day of reflection. We've come a long way, but we still have a lot of work to do. The challenges we face are not easy, but they are not insurmountable. If we continue to work together, to listen to each other, and to fight for what's right, I believe we can create a better future for all of us." The audience erupted into applause, and the politician felt a surge of pride. He knew that his journey was far from over, but he also knew that he was on the right path. The judge, who had also been invited to the ceremony, watched from the audience with a sense of pride. He had seen the politician at his lowest point, and now he was seeing him at his best. It was a reminder that people are capable of change, no matter how far they may have strayed from the right path. As the ceremony ended, the judge and the politician found themselves standing next to each other. They exchanged a few words, their conversation brief but meaningful. There was no need for grand gestures or lengthy speeches, they both understood the significance of the moment. The story was far from over, but it felt like a new chapter had begun. The judge and the politician, each in their own way, had taken steps toward creating a more just and equitable society. Their journeys were different, but they were united by a common goal: to make the world a better place, one step at a time. Despite the progress made by the coalition, the road ahead was far from smooth. The politicians' efforts to address systemic inequality were met with both praise and resistance. While many people supported the changes, others pushed back, fearing that the new policies would disrupt the status quo. The politician found himself facing criticism from all sides, and the pressure began to weigh on him. One particularly challenging day, the politician received a scathing editorial in a major newspaper. The article accused him of using the coalition's work as a way to rehabilitate his image and questioned the sincerity of his efforts. The word stung, and for a moment, the politician felt the old doubts creeping back in. Was he really making a difference, or was he just trying to save his career? He shared his concerns with one of his closest advisors, who listened patiently before offering some advice. "You can't control what people say about you," the advisor said. "All you can do is stay focused on the work. If you believe in what you're doing, that's what matters." The politician took the advice to heart. He knew that he couldn't please everyone, but he also knew that the work he was doing was important. He resolved to stay the course, no matter how difficult it became. Meanwhile, the judge continued to support the coalition's efforts, offering guidance and insight whenever needed. His involvement had brought a sense of credibility to the group, and his calm, measured approach helped to keep everyone focused on the bigger picture. But even he faced challenges. Some of his colleagues questioned his decision to get involved in what they saw as a political issue, and there were moments when he wondered if he had made the right choice. One evening, after a particularly long day, the judge sat in his study, reflecting on the journey so far. He thought about the politician and the progress he had made. He thought about the students he had met and the hope they represented. And he thought about the work that still needed to be done. It was a lot to take in, but he knew that he couldn't give up. The stakes were too high. The next morning, the judge received a call from the politician. He sounded tired but determined. "I need your advice," the politician said. "We're facing some serious pushback on the new legislation, and I'm not sure how to handle it." The judge listened carefully as the politician explained the situation. The opposition had grown louder, with some lawmakers threatening to block the legislation altogether. It was a critical moment, and the politician knew that the coalition's next steps would determine the fate of the bill. The judge thought for a moment before responding. "You need to remind people why this matters," he said. "Tell them the stories of the people who will benefit from this legislation. Make it personal. When people understand the real impact of these policies, it's harder for them to turn away." The politician took the advice to heart. He organized a series of public hearings, inviting students, parents, and teachers to share their experiences. The hearings were emotional and powerful, with many people breaking down in tears as they spoke. The media coverage was extensive, and the public response was overwhelmingly positive. As the hearings continued, the tide began to turn. Lawmakers who had been hesitant to support the legislation started to change their minds. They saw the faces and heard the voices of the people who would be affected, and it made a difference. The politician felt a renewed sense of hope as he realized that they were gaining momentum. One of the most powerful moments came during the final hearing, when a young girl stood up to speak. She was no more than 10 years old, but her words carried a weight that belied her age. "I just want to go to a school where I can learn," she said. "Where I don't have to worry about the roof leaking or the books being old. Is that too much to ask?" The room fell silent as she spoke, and when she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. The politician, who had been taking notes, put down his pen and looked at the girl. "No," he said quietly. "It's not too much to ask. And we're going to make sure you get it." The moment was captured on camera and quickly went viral. It became a rallying cry for the coalition's efforts, and support for the legislation grew even stronger. The politician knew that they were on the verge of something significant, but he also knew that they couldn't let up. The final vote was just days away, and they needed to keep pushing. On the day of the vote, the politician stood outside the Capitol building, surrounded by supporters. He felt a mix of nerves and excitement as he prepared to address the crowd. "This is it," he said. "This is our chance to make a real difference. No matter what happens today, I want you to know that I'm proud of what we've accomplished together. And I'm not going to stop fighting for what's right." The crowd erupted into cheers, and the politician felt a surge of determination. He knew that the road ahead would still be challenging, but he also knew that they were on the right path. As he walked into the Capitol building, he felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in a long time. The judge, who had been watching from the sidelines, felt a sense of pride as he saw the politician step up to the podium. He knew that the journey had been difficult, but he also knew that it had been worth it. The coalition's work had brought people together and sparked a conversation that needed to happen. And now, they were on the verge of making history. As the vote began, the tension in the room was palpable. The politician held his breath as the results were announced. When the final tally was revealed, the room erupted into cheers. The legislation had passed. It was a moment of triumph, but it was also a moment of reflection. The politician knew that this was just the beginning. There was still so much work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful about the future. The judge, watching from the gallery, felt a sense of satisfaction. He knew that the road ahead would still be challenging, but he also knew that they had taken an important step forward. The story was far from over, but it felt like a new chapter had begun. The passage of the legislation marked a significant milestone, but it was only the beginning. The work of the coalition continued, with new projects and initiatives aimed at addressing systemic inequality. The politician, once known for his arrogance and disrespect, had become a symbol of redemption and change. His journey had been far from easy, but it had also been transformative. In the months that followed, the politician worked tirelessly to ensure that the legislation was implemented effectively. He traveled to schools in underserved communities, meeting with students, teachers, and parents to see firsthand the impact of the new policies. The changes were small at first: new textbooks, repaired buildings, and additional resources, but they made a big difference. For the first time in years, these schools had the tools they needed to provide a quality education. One day, the politician visited the school where the young girl who had spoken at the hearing was a student. He was greeted with cheers and applause, but what struck him most was the hope in the children's eyes. They saw him not as a disgraced politician, but as someone who had fought for them. It was a humbling experience, and it reminded him why he had started this journey in the first place. The judge, too, continued to play a key role in the coalition's work. His involvement had brought a sense of credibility and integrity to the group, and his calm, measured approach helped to keep everyone focused on the bigger picture. He also continued to serve on the bench, bringing the same level of fairness and dedication to his work as he always had. But now, there was a new sense of purpose in what he did. He knew that his actions, both in and out of the courtroom, were part of a larger effort to create a more just and equitable society. One evening, the judge received a letter from the politician. It was a heartfelt note, thanking him for his guidance and support. "I know I've made mistakes," the politician wrote. "But I also know that I wouldn't be where I am today without your help. You showed me what it means to stand up for what's right, and I'll always be grateful for that." The judge was touched by the letter. It was a reminder that even small acts of courage and kindness could have a lasting impact. He wrote back, encouraging the politician to stay the course and continue fighting for what he believed in. As time went on, the coalition's work began to gain national attention. Other states started to take notice, and some even began to implement similar policies. The politician, once a controversial figure, was now seen as a leader in the fight for racial justice and equality. It was a role he had never imagined for himself, but it was one he embraced with humility and determination. The judge, too, found himself in the spotlight. He was invited to speak at conferences and events, where he shared his insights on justice, equality, and the importance of standing up for what's right. He never sought out the attention, but he understood the importance of using his platform to inspire others. One day, the judge and the politician found themselves speaking at the same event. It was a conference on racial justice, and both men had been invited to share their experiences. When the politician took the stage, he spoke about his journey, the mistakes he had made, the lessons he had learned, and the work he was doing to make amends. "Change is possible," he said. "But it starts with acknowledging our mistakes and committing to do better. It's not easy, but it's worth it." When the judge took the stage, he spoke about the importance of integrity and the power of second chances. "We all have the capacity to change," he said. "But it's up to us to take that first step. And when we do, we can create a ripple effect that touches countless lives." The audience was moved by their words, and the event ended with a standing ovation. As the crowd dispersed, the judge and the politician found themselves standing next to each other. They exchanged a few words, their conversation brief but meaningful. There was no need for grand gestures or lengthy speeches, they both understood the significance of the moment. The story of the rude politician who had disrespected a black judge in court had come full circle. What had started as a moment of conflict and tension had become a story of redemption, growth, and hope. Both men had been changed by the experience, and their actions had inspired others to reflect on their own biases and take steps toward creating a more just and equitable society. As the years went by, the coalition's work continued to make a difference. The legislation they had fought for became a model for other states, and the impact of their efforts was felt far and wide. The politician, once known for his arrogance, had become a champion for change. And the judge, who had always stood for fairness and integrity, had inspired countless others to do the same. The story was a reminder that no one is beyond redemption, and that even the smallest acts of courage can have a lasting impact. It was a story of hope, resilience, and the power of second chances. And it was a story that would continue to inspire others for years to come.